Welcome to When We Die Talks. I'm your host, Zach Ancell. In this podcast, we explore different beliefs about what happens when we die and how those ideas shape the way we live. Thanks for tuning in. I'm glad you're here. This episode is brought to you by The Dead Book. Okay, let's get real for a second. How prepared are your parents, your siblings, your partner, or even you for the future? We're not talking about the fun stuff, but the hard stuff, end-of-life planning. It's a tough conversation, but that's why The Dead Book exists. The Dead Book makes it easy to plan ahead, even if you think you don't have the time, money, or assets. It's affordable, straightforward, and designed to give you and your loved ones peace of mind. They've made it their mission to help others avoid the chaos and stress that comes with being unprepared. Visit thedeadbook.co and get started today. And just for listening, use the code WWDT at checkout for 15% off. Hey everyone, before I get into this episode, I wanted to give a quick update on the project. Last week, I skipped the reflection episode for the Zach Phillips interview without much warning, or really any warning at all. The truth is, I've realized how hard it is to keep everything going. Coordinating interviews, creating social posts, listening back to episodes to give the editor notes. It's a lot. And this isn't my job. At this point, When We Die Talks is purely a passion project. And between my photography business and regular life stuff, it just kind of all came to a head last week. For now, I think I'm going to hold off on doing more reflection episodes. Maybe I'll start incorporating some of that into these interviews or into social media posts, but I'm not going to make any promises right now. My main focus is to continue bringing you conversations with people who have interesting stories and perspectives on death. Just making that happen every other week is already a lot, and I don't want to get too bogged down trying to do too many things. With that in mind, I'm planning for the next episode to be another voicemail-only episode. So if you've been thinking about calling in, now's a great time. Your thoughts could end up in that episode. The number is 971-328-0864, and I'd love to hear your perspective on what you think happens when we die. Now, on to today's episode. It's one that I've been excited about for a long time. My guest today is my dad. This conversation has been a long time coming. When I first started the podcast, he was the first person I wanted to interview, but for a variety of reasons that didn't happen. But everything has its timing, and maybe it always was meant to happen now. My dad and I have had plenty of deep conversations, usually over a glass of tequila, and this one isn't that much different except we recorded it. We talk about his relationship with death, how it's evolved over time, and how he approaches mortality in a much more pragmatic way than I do. In some ways, we share similar beliefs about what happens when we die, but while I've spent much of my life anxious about it, he seems to have found peace. We talk about moments that shaped him, what gives him comfort, and even poses some interesting questions about death. It's a personal episode and a big turning point for the podcast, one where I start bringing my own fears and anxieties into these conversations. I hope you enjoy. It's not shocking that we are having another serious conversation over tequila.
There you go. It's the best way to have them.
I was going to say pretty traditional for us. When I first had the idea of the podcast, you were the first person that I wanted to interview. And I think we even had it set up to do it. And I just don't remember which life circumstances last year kind of got in the way. But yeah, I always kind of envisioned you and I starting out the podcast. And I think this kind of makes sense. Well, number one, that we're drinking tequila, but also as I'm shifting the podcast a little bit to be more kind of about my fears and anxieties, that, I think this is a perfect time for us to do it. And thank you for doing this. I'm sure you're probably not super pumped to be on camera.
Oh, definitely not on camera.
But you do like having deep conversations.
Absolutely. On audio.
Well, yeah, most of it will just be audio. We won't use your face too much.
And tequila, yes.
Yeah.
It helps with the deep conversations.
So maybe we start with, the initial question. What is your relationship with death? What has your experience been with death in your life? Well,
probably at my age, fairly typical. And so, at first when I thought about this question, I thought, not going to be much to say. My father has died. My grandparents have died. My mother's still alive. But the more I thought about it, I thought, there have been a couple more impactful deaths. And with the first one being when I was relatively young, I was probably 20, 21, maybe 22, but I don't think so. I had a cousin who had always been like my favorite cousin, my hero. And he was probably 5, 6 years older than me.
Was that little Keith or no?
Yeah. And he was a big athlete. He played baseball. He had a football scholarship to a small college. But then he wound up being diagnosed with Hodgkin's disease and went through, multiple years of surgery and remission and surgery and remission. And I think in the end, he just got tired of dealing with that kind of wheel. And at the time then when he died, he was probably 26, 27. And I hadn't seen him for a while. They had moved away and I hadn't seen him for quite a while. But, that was one that was just, and I think largely because he was so young and maybe partly because I was so young, and just the reality of, this happens. And it happens, by that time I'd had multiple grandparents die, but that seemed more natural.
Yeah, it was in time.
Yes, exactly. Although the other one, I think I mentioned something to you about that in thinking about this conversation. I also had this memory that I probably hadn't thought about for who knows how long, of my grandfather's funeral. That was, the whole thing was just kind of, that was probably literally my first experience with death. And, I remember the phone call coming and my dad leaving, but then I remember the funeral. And the thing that was so strange about it, one, there were a lot of people there and, a lot of people from his work who obviously I didn't know. But two, the one that was, I don't know, I guess the only real word to use is frightening, was my aunt. So my uncle's, my dad's brother's wife was just hysterical. I mean, she was really close to my grandparents, but I mean, she was wailing. And it was just weird to see someone who was that distressed over something that probably at the time was kind of, he died. And then the other one that was weird was the whole walk past the open casket. That was strange. And then, some number of years later, I was probably in my mid 30s, early 30s. And there was a guy at work who was, it wasn't like we hung out every weekend or anything, but a good friend at work. And I remember he was 40 years old. He had 2 young kids. And I think it was a situation where there had been signs of issues that he had just ignored and, not gone to the doctor and dealt with. And then the next thing you know, it's like, stage 4 cancer, and died at 40 years old. And that was another one that was pretty impactful, again, in terms of you never know when this happens. It's not just the progression of, old people die.
Yeah, that's part of it.
All kinds of people die.
Yeah, I think for me, and it was about almost exactly 10 years ago. Because, I remember when Grandma Marvy died, so my great-grandma, your grandma, but I was, in college. I was in Colorado when it happened, but I didn't go to the funeral or anything like that.
And she was in her early 90s.
Yeah,
she had lived a long life.
Yeah. But yeah, I think for me, outside, I had a teammate in high school who had a brother die. I think that was kind of the first funeral that I ever remember. But yeah, about 10 years ago, that's when Grandpa Keith, your dad, and Grandpa Carl died within a month. And that was just kind of like a weird sequence of events of like...
So close.
I was going to say, and it's even hard to kind of remember, because I think we came out Brittany and I came out to see Carl because he was in the hospital or something. I guess that's maybe when we came out for the funeral and Carl then went into the hospital. But I just remember with that one, with Keith, I remember he went to the hospital, at least from, my recollection, was in the hospital or whatever. And then you called me and said, yeah, he's not doing well. I remember booking a ticket. And then about 30 minutes later, you call and you're like, don't come, he already passed. And then I just remember calling, I think it was Delta back, and just bawling, basically being like, hey, can I cancel the ticket that I just bought because my grandpa just died? But I think that was really, for me, kind of the first real experiences that I had. And it was really tangled because it was that weird month of both of them passing, me moving back from New York to Oregon. So yeah, that was a really weird time.
It was literally it was April 1st and May 5th.
Yeah, of 2015.
I wasn't at the hospital.
Yeah, I remember. I think Brad told you.
I was in Virginia. And my brother called me and said that he wasn't doing well, or maybe his wife called me and said he wasn't doing well. And I'd started to look into getting a flight. And then my brother called me and said, he's gone.
Yeah.
So yeah, I wasn't in Colorado at the time.
Yeah, it's just hard to remember because I kind of already mentioned it, but it's back for his funeral, which was kind of interesting because it was, I guess it was maybe very stereotypical, I guess, but then it was going to like the military. That
was the one that was interesting even for me, is I never really thought of my father as a military guy, but it was a military funeral.
Yeah, that was, I don't know, it was very interesting. And I think that was the real experience with that, because with Carl, we didn't do anything outside of, I think maybe a year later, we went back to Iowa and buried his ashes, but that didn't happen immediately. Mm-hmm. And then Grandma Bernie, that was kind of COVID era. So yeah, I think Grandpa Keith's really the only funeral that I remember going to, and outside of that one in high school, which I don't really even remember that well.
But then you want to know the other one that's weird? So the one of your grandparents that is still alive, I still remember it happening. And at the time we were all like, and you talked about it in your introductory episode, and we were all like, that was really weird. And now it's like how you sign off every episode.
Yeah.
The whole, have a good life.
Have a good life. Yeah.
And at the time it was like, God, that's so strange that she said that, when she's kind of saying goodbye. But in hindsight, it's like, maybe not at all.
Yeah. There's been a couple of those nuggets in the interviews. I think the one with Don, and it wasn't even him, but it was someone who asked him, and I talked about this in kind of the reflection episode, but it was, how does it feel to be dying? Someone asked him that, and it was just like, we're all dying. That's a question that,
we're all terminal, man.
That person could ask themselves. But yeah, so I think, before I do an interview, I kind of jot down kind of notes of, this is what I want to talk about the intro. This is kind of, and especially with yours, I'm like, maybe not fully, but I know a lot about your relationship with death. And I even wrote down that I don't think it's the people that you've lost that makes your relationship with death interesting, but the way that you approach it. Because I think the conversations that we've had, last year we were talking, to your lawyer about all the things that happen the moment that you die. And I've talked about on the podcast that maybe people think I'm joking, but that you're totally fine getting put in a coffee can.
Oh, yeah. I've always said that. Or I've said that at least for a long time. When you dump the ashes, just don't let it blow all over everybody.
Yeah, I'll make sure that doesn't happen. Although that'd probably be your perfect Big Lebowski
there
moment.
You go.
That's how you really want to go out. We'll just have to find a Donnie to...
as long as you can get Walter to give the kind of eulogy.
That's true. He is a dog, though.
Well, that's a problem.
But yeah, so I think the interesting thing in a lot of the conversations that we've had around death, and maybe the best way to go about this is talking about what you think happens when we die. But I do think, at least in our conversations around death, I would say you have a very, and I think this is just who you are as a person too, you have like a very pragmatic and non-emotional approach to a lot of things.
People would say that about me in regard to a lot of things.
And so I think that is kind of how it feels about, when we talk about death, and I feel like I'm at the opposite end of the spectrum. But so yeah, maybe as we're kind of moving into that, the best thing is to talk about first, what do you think happens when we die?
That's interesting because in a way, I think my thought around that has not necessarily changed, but evolved some, because for a long time, I would always say, I think it's like game over, end of scene, fade to black, done.
Which I don't know if before you go any further, I don't think you're stealing those words from me. I think I've stolen those words from you. I don't think that's from you listening to the podcast and being like, oh yeah, game over. It's like, I think...
Oh no, we've certainly talked about this before the podcast.
Yeah. Yeah. I've heard you say that before. And so it's, I think there's similar beliefs there, but anyway, continue.
But the only thing that I would say in terms of, evolution of that thought, but in a way doesn't really change anything is, and I wish I understood better and I don't, but just kind of the whole, my very rudimentary understanding of physics and the whole thing of matter and energy and how it's not destroyed. It's just sort of repurposed. And so, maybe that's what I would say is, but I still think that unlike I think a lot of people when they get into that sort of thought, I do still think that it's fade to black. I don't think that your energy, let's just say that energy is conserved and goes somewhere. The example that I always like best is the whole ocean example. You're part of this big ocean, and then this wave forms, and that's kind of your individual consciousness of this life. And then that wave goes back into the ocean. And I don't believe that conservation of energy, that any of you survives that. I don't think, so there's a piece of me out there that's stardust. And it's like, only in the most abstract sense. It's not really you. It's just energy. And it's energy that was out there before you existed. And there's energy that's out there while you exist. And there's energy that's out there after you exist. So I'm not sure that it really changes the thought at all of, you're born, you live, you die. And at those two ends, there's nothing. And, one thing I heard someone talk about was that I thought was really interesting is the idea of, well, where do you think you were? How did you exist before you were born? And, maybe the best explanation is that's the exact same place that you go when you die. But again, I think it all does boil down to it's just done. Your story's over and it's done.
I think that's a place that I'm dancing around a lot in thought, because a lot of people, talk about this energy and going back to this pool of energy. I think there's people like you who talk about from the most basic scientific standpoint, the law of conservation of energy. Energy is not destroyed or created, whatever. So I think there's one nugget that I haven't really asked anybody, and I'm not necessarily asking you or asking you to solve it because I think it's very difficult, but I think this is the root question of a lot of my thought around death right now is, so what is consciousness? Because if consciousness is just, part of that energy in the brain, does that consciousness go away? Or I think, and I think that is maybe the two branches that if the consciousness is separate in some way, somehow, then I think that alludes to maybe something different. But I think that's ultimately what I've kind of really boiled it down to in some ways is that's kind of the fork in the road a little bit. Is consciousness something different than essentially your body in a way? Because I think that really gets to the heart of it of if it is separate, then I think there's a lot of possibility, right? Because then that's in a sense a little bit of something, magic that we don't understand or whatever. But if it's not, then I in my thought experiments find it hard to believe that if consciousness is just brain synapses firing in a certain way, then how does that continue outside of this? Like it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah. And I think, then you get into big philosophical inquiries and discussions and whatever about what is consciousness and is it in your brain or is it separate from your brain and all of those things. And the thing that I would say, if you put all of those aside, and those are all really interesting questions to think about and talk about, I still think that no matter what consciousness is, when you die, it goes away. And the only way, and this one gets really interesting also is, the whole idea of when you die, the only way in which you continue is people remembering you, people. And, I remember reading a really interesting book. I can't even think the name of it now, but it was, all of these people were in a place. You can call it heaven. I don't think they did, but what was happening is you existed in this place until nobody remembered you anymore. And then you were gone. And there was some kind of plague or pandemic or something. This was well before COVID. I remember reading this book. And there were huge sections of this place that were disappearing. And it was because there were these huge number of deaths that were going on. And so like entire neighborhoods and things, it's like overnight, that whole area is gone. That whole area is gone. But it was all based on this thought of, you exist as long as someone remembers you.
I don't necessarily know if I don't want to misrepresent, but I mean, at least from movies like Coco, I think that's partially the idea behind Dia de Muertos.
Right.
Which fits in perfectly with the tequila that we're drinking. The Muertos tequila.
Yeah, that you're still remembering.
Yeah.
But the only other one that I thought was interesting that I heard relatively recently was this idea that said, yeah, people always talk about legacy and all of these things. And it said, do you know anything about your grandfather's father? Or go one more generation back.
Yeah.
Your great grandfather's father. And I think it gives you an idea of how short that memory is, right? I mean, we all still remember George Washington or Abraham Lincoln.
What we've been told about them.
Right.
Right. And I think that's the other thing that I think about this topic a little bit too is, and especially in the relationship with you and I would say I know you fairly well, probably better than almost anyone. But my idea of you is not, or who I think you are is not actually who you are. It's my idea of you.
Yeah. And so that question of they remember you, I don't think, I didn't parse it down to, but do they remember the real you? Does anybody really know the real you? Do you know the real you? Yeah. I don't think it was that. I think
that's
it was
another,
just...
I was going to say, that's another one of those deep philosophical questions.
Yep.
But yeah, so I think part of, I think we have this kind of similar, and I think mine's shifting a little bit because I do think there's some stuff that, in my reading and just talking to people, I think there is some things about energy. And I've even used a line that you've kind of said a little bit, like we've talked about, but you've definitely said it of like, you think that the current religion of the world is science.
Oh, yeah.
And how that also doesn't necessarily, like in 1,000 years, the science is going to be different. And, we're going to know more about, if we're still around, the humans, not us, obviously, but does that change? And we do know more about how energy works and, how we're connected and this and that. And so I think there's part of, what I'm learning about that has me kind of like, there is some weirdness. There is some magic, I think. But I think we do have similar thoughts, but we're at the opposite ends of the spectrum.
In regard to our relationship about that event.
Yeah, that comfort around it. You in our conversations are very comfortable with the idea around death. And we did talk about it a little bit before we started recording, that there's a whole difference between saying it and believing it to some extent. But yeah, I feel like my anxiety and fear are high and your anxiety and fear are low around the topic. And so what gives you that peace around this idea? Because I think a lot of people are like, well, I'm at peace because I'm going to go to heaven, or I'm at peace because I know I'm going to, this is the worst of it. And I'm going to go to this eternal pool of energy and, or I'm going to be reincarnated, or I'm going to go to this next life. But when you're talking about game over, fade to black, how do you find comfort in that?
I think largely just because of the inevitability of it. I've said a lot of times, I'm sure I've said it to you before, of every single human being on this earth, if you're going to write their biography, you know how it ends, right? For every single person, the last sentence of that biography is, and then they died. Everybody. And so I think it's that, right? It's the inevitability of this is going to happen.
I think and I have that written in my notes, everybody's going to die in quotes, because I knew that you would bring that up. And I think that's one of those ones where I'm like, yeah, but that still doesn't bring me any peace. Even though everybody's going to do it, like, and I can't necessarily think of, I even thought about, because I knew this would come up, what's another example along those lines of something that everybody does, but it's like, yeah, I'm still scared of it. I couldn't quite come up with anything, but that statement of, well, yeah, just because everybody's going to do it, that doesn't bring me any peace. It doesn't necessarily make it worse, but it doesn't make it better for me.
And I think that what I would say, and I definitely can't think of anything off the top of my head, is I know the one that immediately comes to mind, but it's not as kind of final, but it's like, hey, you know what? Everybody's going to lose their baby teeth and grow new teeth. But nobody worries about that. No one's like, oh my God, I'm going to grow a whole new set of teeth.
Yeah.
Or I think what you kind of have to look through is other biological functions that are just like, hey, you know what? This is going to, and I mean, one of them is, I guess what you could say is, every 365 and a quarter days or whatever, you're going to be a year older.
Yeah.
Contrary to, dudes who are spending $1 million or whatever and transfusing blood and taking a gazillion supplements every day. I don't think that's going to change it. It's just you are going to continue to grow old. And can you impact the quality of that growing old? Probably. But can you change the fact that you're going to grow old, and at some point, whether it's at, like my friend 40, or if it's at 60, or if it's at 92, like grandma, someday it's just going to be done.
It is, I think, mostly just men trying to live forever. But I wouldn't want that either. I'm not saying, I do want to live forever, but it is, it feels like there's this like hard stop that I'm like, that's kind of freaky. And I think, it is in that class that I was taking last year. It's, there's the fear of dying, and fear of death. And I think a lot of people, and it wasn't kind of till this eye injury that I really started kind of extrapolating out, the fear of dying. I don't necessarily want to like decompose isn't necessarily the right way of saying it, but I don't want to just, start falling apart, but I know that that's part of the process. And I think that's something that you would say is like, you're not super pumped to, you don't love the idea of dying, but you're not afraid of death.
Right. Well, and I think those are distinctly different things, right? Because, the dying part, I don't want to be ravaged by cancer and living in misery for 2 years. And, my preference would be, you go to sleep one night, you just don't wake up the next morning. Yeah. So the dying part, I think, is definitely more anxiety inducing or whatever. But the death part is just inevitable. And, you just said another one that always makes me think, you've heard me say this before. I think, for everyone who listens, I think there's two really interesting questions to have a conversation with people about. And one of them is, if you could live forever, and I mean forever, would you want to? And I've read a couple of books. I think one of them was called Forever by Pete Hamill. And then there's also the whole vampire books by Anne Rice. And that, the people who are living forever, to some degree, I mean, you see the people you love grow old and die. You see the society you live in grow old and die. And so I think it's a really interesting question. Would you want to live forever? And then the second one is, if you could know exactly when you were going to die, would you want to know? And it's amazing to me, the people who say yes. Yeah. And then the people who say no, because that one, I would say, the first one, I would say the majority of people, once they think about it a little bit, say, nah, I don't think I'd want to live forever. But would you want to know when? And you don't know how, you just know when. It's going to be April 22nd, 2052 at 11:13 a.m. Would you want to know?
That's definitely a much harder question.
Definitely. And the one that's interesting, I remember one conversation between two people that, one of the people said, and it was a couple, right? And one of them said, I wouldn't want to know. And the other one got a little upset with him. It was like, you wouldn't want to tell me so that I could prepare for it and do this and do that. And the other one is eventually like, well, okay, I'll find out.
Got badgered into it.
But I think those are two really interesting, you're sitting around having a drink or doing whatever, and interesting conversation questions.
Yeah. If I had to answer, I mean, the first one, like you said, no, I wouldn't want to live forever. I think at this current moment, and it might be the tequila.
Tequila will do it to you.
I would possibly say that I'd want to know.
The first one, live forever. I've definitely gone back and forth. I was like, God, just think of all the books I could read. Just think of all the things I could do. Just think of all the knowledge I could acquire.
Both of our reading, and yours is worse than mine, both of our reading lists are out of control.
Oh,
If we could live forever, that list
I still don't know if I would finish.
That list is not going to get smaller. It's just
I agree.
Get bigger and bigger.
But the second one, I definitely go back and forth more about, of would you want to know when? I have my times where I say, absolutely, I'd want to know, because then you can kind of do things to prepare for, hey, I have a year, or, I have 4 years, right? Whatever. But other times I'm like, kind of weird.
Yeah. Yeah. It would be weird to know for sure. And so, I think, the last question, and when I kind of started working on the podcast and coming up with ideas, and I mentioned this in Don's episode too, this was the question that I wrote. And I think partially because I thought you were going to be the first interview, but the question of, and I'm going to make it even more personalized, but, what would you want Britt and I to know if you were to die tomorrow? outside of all the stuff that we already know about the lawyer and, who to
Right.
call and all that stuff. But, what about you would you want us to know?
I mean, I think it's really just a couple of things, and it's maybe for everyone in your life, and particularly for you two, I'd want them to know that I love them, but I'd also want them to know that I did the best that I could and that I know far from perfect, right? But you do the best that you can and you make a lot of mistakes and you cause hurt and you cause pain and hopefully sometimes you cause happiness or joy. But I think those two things, that you love them and that you did the best that you could, which is far from perfect.
Which is all that we can ask of anybody, right?
I don't know. I think there's a lot of people who expect more than that, but
that's fair.
I think it's unrealistic to expect more than that, but I think there's plenty of people who do, trying to be good.
And it's, I think in general, everybody is trying the best that they can. And, you just don't know what anybody else is going through. And so, it's like, I definitely know some of the stuff that you went through in childhood and stuff like that. And it's that impacted how you raised Britt and I. And that's part of doing the best that you could and trying to say, I'm not going to do that, or I'm going to do this because of that. And
well, and even things that you say that you're not going to do, I'm not going to be like my parents. And it's like, oh crap, I kind of am. But I think that, are there bad people in the world? Probably. But the majority of people just trying to get by, just trying to do the best that they can. And I love that thought of, you don't know what anyone else is going through.
Yeah.
And, I think one of the greatest things to read about that is that, and I won't remember exactly the name of it, but it's a David Foster Wallace thing about something about water. Is this water? This is water. And, his comments in there about how we operate on a default setting and how we don't really appreciate, did you ever consider the person who cut you off in traffic was rushing a loved one to the emergency room? Or, maybe they're not, maybe they're just a jerk, but, other people have shit going on in their lives too.
And it's almost better to think of humanity that way in a sense. Because what does it hurt to think that way versus saying, that person's an asshole and they had a vendetta out against me and that's why they cut me off.
Well, or even worse, right, is then you get all pissed off and you escalate it because, that asshole cut me off. So now I'm going to cut them off to show them. And it's just like, what good is that doing?
Yeah.
And particularly not even for the other person, but what good is it doing for you?
Yeah. I don't know why, but this does make me, I think we'll wrap it up soon, but it does make me think a little bit about the coffee can a little bit.
Now, the only thing that, just to put a little context, I used to be even more extreme with the statement and say, hey, put me in a coffee can, but then dump the contents of the coffee can in the toilet and flush it. And that one really upsets people.
Yeah.
But again, I don't know that it really makes any difference, but yeah.
And I don't necessarily know how I was correlating the two in the moment, because now I'm just thinking about flushing your ashes down the toilet. But I think the way that, I think I needed to give some context to something that I've brought up in a couple episodes, because you have said, put me in a coffee can. But I think it gets back to that kind of very pragmatic approach to death in a sense. And you've kind of said that you don't really care what happens at your funeral. You don't need it to be anything because it's not about you anymore.
No, I mean, but the thing that I do think is important is it's about the people who are left. And so if they think we want to have a big funeral, do it. Yeah. If they think, we want to dance and sing, do it. If they think, we want to have a small group of people go out to dinner, do it. If they, because it's really for them. It's what provides them with some level of comfort.
Yeah.
That's really, do whatever accomplishes that.
Yeah.
Even to the point that I would say, hey, if someone said, well, the thing that would really provide comfort is, to have a plot at a cemetery where I could go and I could sit next to it and I could feel close and I could have a conversation. I mean, that's how my grandmother was with my grandfather.
Yeah.
She would go and sit and talk. And I might see that and say, don't think that's doing anything. But For her, it did. And that's all that mattered. It's really about the people who are left.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's the one thing that you've kind of made very clear is it's, whatever. And it's more than just Britt and I, but, whatever is going to bring comfort to Britt and I in that situation. And it'd be maybe a little difficult to visit, but maybe we should spread you in some agave fields in Mexico.
There you go.
And then, they can make a tequila out of you.
There you go. That works. I'm good with that.
Yeah. But yeah, I think.
Or, just toss it in the Tahona.
Yeah. God, that sounds terrible.
Kind of does. I mean, you want to talk about, then it's going to be kind of smoky, ashy.
Yeah.
That'll have, there's Dad. That's Dad.
The Dad batch.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, the El Jefe batch.
It's in the aroma and the flavor.
Yeah, it's all encompassing.
There's a real aftertaste, though.
Yeah. You'll be left remembering it for sure.
There you go. You'll never forget it.
Yeah. But I mean, this is the point where I usually like, how can people get in touch with you? And the answer is don't get in touch.
Don't. There's no way
to get in touch. So many friends that are like, when is your dad coming to Portland? So yeah, maybe when you come up here or
we'll have a little When We Die Talks meeting. A little When We Die Talks celebration.
Yeah.
With maybe a little tequila.
I was going to say, or if you're in Colorado at some point and prove your worthiness of tequila.
Come over. We'll have a drink.
Then maybe you can have a drink.
Absolutely.
But yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thanks for doing this.
All right. No, this is great. We've been talking about it for a while.
Yeah. Yeah. It's been, I don't know.
Yeah, it's fun.
It's been probably not quite a year, but probably about 9 months. Cause I think this was the point last year where I was like, all right, got to build the studio. And that was my whole stalling mechanism at the beginning.
Right.
I got
everything constructed.
I got to soundproof the room, which, now we're doing this remote where you're not even a soundproof room.
That's when you got from me. The procrastinating to put off doing something that needs to be done. Yeah. I'm pretty good at that.
Well, yeah. Thanks for that. That and the piles that I have everywhere.
There you go. The piles. You should see my house.
Maybe that's what I'll do with your ashes.
Just put them in a pile?
I'm going to have them turn it into paper and just have a perpetual pile.
I say you do like one of those fake books where you cut out I remember doing that as a kid, taking a literal book, right? Not one of those ones that they make now, and cutting out so that you could stash some stuff in there. You do that, just fill it up with ashes. Okay.
Here's my challenge to you. And I know that this now
Which book?
I was going to say, you have to come up with which book. And this will immediately send you into a tailspin of, all right, well, I got to build a list.
I build a list. The list will have at least 100 books on it. And then it'll take me 3 months, maybe more, to figure out.
This will take you
the rest of my life. You'll be left with, well, I narrowed the 100 down to 12. So pick any one of these 12.
So pick which one you think was best.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which one is most appropriate? That sums it up.
That's a new project for you.
That sums it up. Perfect way to finish.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you. And
all right. Thank you. Love you.
Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of When We Die Talks. I hope today's conversation sparked some thoughts and helped you feel a little more at ease with the idea of death. Remember, this journey is all about exploring our beliefs and fears together, so I'd love to hear from you. Call our voicemail at 971-328-0864 and share what you think happens when we die. Your thoughts might just be featured on a future episode and could help others on their own journey. Until next time, have a good life.